An American B-17 flying fortress lumbers through the darkness at 20,000 feet. The crew is exhausted, oxygen masks fogging with every breath, fingers numb inside their gloves. Below them, nothing but black. Above them, nothing but stars. And somewhere out there, invisible in the dark, something is hunting them. Then the tail gunner screams. Not because he sees a fighter. Not because flak is bursting around them. He screams because the bomber in front of them, a plane he's been watching for 4 hours, suddenly erupts in a column of fire. No warning, no diving Messerschmitt, no tracer rounds, just a massive, instantaneous explosion, and then the sky where that aircraft used to be is empty. The crew of that B-17 never knew what hit them. Neither did the Americans for months. Something was killing their planes in the dark, and no one could explain how. To understand what was happening over Germany in 1943, you have to understand just how badly the Allies needed to win the air war. By mid-1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had become the cornerstone of Allied strategy. The idea was brutal in its simplicity: destroy Germany's factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and industrial infrastructure from the air, and eventually the Wehrmacht would grind to a halt. No tanks, no planes, no fuel, no ammunition. Victory without invasion. A war won from above. But nobody told the Germans to cooperate. The Luftwaffe's day fighter force was formidable and aggressive, and American losses during daylight raids were catastrophic. The Schweinfurt raids of October 1943 became a watershed moment. 60 B-17s were shot down in a single day. 60 planes. 600 men, dead or captured. The 8th Air Force was losing entire combat groups faster than they could be replaced. Commanding generals stared at casualty reports and wondered whether the strategic bombing campaign could survive at all. The British had a different approach. The Royal Air Force, having already learned brutal lessons about daylight bombing in 1940, had switched to night operations. Bomb Germany while it slept. Hit cities, industrial zones, and population centers under the cover of darkness, when German fighters theoretically couldn't find you. It seemed logical. It seemed survivable. It wasn't. RAF Bomber Command was hemorrhaging aircraft at a rate that staggered even the most battle-hardened commanders. Entire squadrons were disappearing on single raids over Hamburg, Berlin, and the Ruhr Valley. Pilots who survived one tour of operations were rare enough to be considered almost mythical. The losses were so severe that Bomber Command's leadership debated in private whether the offensive could continue. There weren't enough replacement crews, there weren't enough replacement planes, and most terrifyingly, nobody could explain exactly where all the losses were coming from. Flak was expected. Day fighters were expected. But aircraft were exploding with no visible attacker, no tracer fire, no diving interceptor. Survivors described simply watching other bombers blow up without warning, as though some invisible hand was reaching up through the darkness and swatting them out of the sky. The answer to that mystery had a name, and his name was Rudolf Schönert. Schönert wasn't one of the Luftwaffe's celebrated aces. He wasn't a Galland or a Hartmann, plastered across propaganda posters with a chest full of medals. He was quieter than that, an observant, technically minded pilot who flew night fighters out of necessity rather than glamour. Born in 1911, Schönert had spent the early war years flying conventional night intercept missions, the kind where you used radar guidance from the ground to get close to a bomber stream and then tried to identify and shoot down individual aircraft. It was frustrating, dangerous, and often ineffective work. The fundamental problem with night fighting was geometry. A German fighter pilot approaching a bomber formation from behind sat directly in the cone of fire from the bomber's tail guns. British and American bombers were designed with this in mind. A tail gunner with a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft was one of the most important defensive positions on the plane. Approach from the front, and you had perhaps a 2-second firing window before you were past the target at a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour. Approach from below, and you were visible against the lighter sky to the belly gunner. Approach from above, and the dorsal turret tracked you. There was no clean angle of attack. Every approach vector had a defensive gun covering it. Night fighter pilots accepted that shooting down bombers meant accepting incoming fire. They took losses. They died. And the bombers kept coming. Schonert thought there had to be a better way. He was not the only one asking that question, but he was one of the first to come up with a genuinely radical answer. His insight came from watching, paying attention to the specific geometry of the problem rather than just accepting it as given. Bombers flew in streams. They were arranged in formations, even at night. Loose formations, widely spaced, but formations nonetheless. And those formations had a characteristic shape when viewed from certain angles. What Schonert noticed was this. There was one approach vector that no bomber in the world defended. Directly below, angled slightly forward, the underbelly of the aircraft at a roughly 70-degree upward angle. No gun could depress enough to cover that zone. The belly turret on a B-17 could rotate and fire downward, but it couldn't fire forward and upward at steep angles simultaneously. The tailgun couldn't reach it. The waist guns couldn't reach it. It was a blind spot, a dead zone, a gap in the armor that nobody had ever thought to exploit, because doing so required an entirely different way of flying, and an entirely different way of thinking about aerial combat. What Schonert proposed would be officially designated schräge Musik. In German, the phrase doesn't mean diagonal music. It's a slang term, equivalent to the American expression jazz. Something unexpected. Something that breaks the rules. Something that swings. The concept was elegantly simple and shockingly effective. Remove the standard forward-facing guns from a night fighter. Install two 20mm cannons pointing upward at roughly 70 degrees from the horizontal, mounted directly behind the cockpit. Approach a bomber from below and behind, invisible in the darker portions of the sky, close to within 100 to 300 meters directly beneath the aircraft. Then pull the nose up slightly and fire directly into the bomber's underbelly, specifically into the wing root where the fuel tanks sat. And watch what happens. What happened was fire. Instant, catastrophic fire. Aviation fuel igniting in enclosed wing spaces, pressure building in a fraction of a second, and then a detonation that could be seen for miles. The bomber crew never knew the attack was coming. They heard nothing unusual over the roar of their own engines. Their gunners saw nothing. And then their aircraft ceased to exist. When Schonert first proposed the modification, the reaction from his superiors was skepticism bordering on contempt. Removing forward-facing armament from a combat aircraft violated every instinct of a fighter pilot. How do you fight without guns pointing where you're going? How do you defend yourself if attacked? The proposal seemed to contradict the entire philosophy of aerial warfare as it had been practiced since 1914. Schonert's commanding officers listened, nodded politely, and did approximately nothing. He went ahead and had the modification done anyway. Not through official channels, through the kind of quiet, field-level improvisation that happens in every army when a determined person decides that the paperwork would take longer than the war. In early 1943, working with a ground crew that shared his conviction, Schonert had two upward-firing MGFF cannons installed in his Dornier Du 217 night fighter. He flew it himself. He intended to find out if his theory worked in practice, not in a briefing room. The first operational use of schräge Musik came in May 1943. Schonert positioned his aircraft below a British Lancaster, closed the distance in near total darkness, lined up the firing solution using a simple reflector sight mounted on the cockpit roof, and fired a 2-second burst directly into the bomber's wing root. The Lancaster went down. He did it again. It went down again. But what happened next wasn't triumph. What happened next was silence. By the time Schonert's results were being quietly noted within the Luftwaffe's night fighter command, Nachtjagdgeschwader units across Germany and occupied Europe had begun experimenting with variations of the same concept. Heinkel He, 219S, Messerschmitt B, F-110S, Junkers Ju-88S, nearly every significant German night fighter type eventually received Schräger Musik installations. The modification was not complex. 2 cannons, a modified mount, a small sight. Ground crews could perform the installation in days. The Luftwaffe's chief night fighter commander, General Josef Kammhuber, had initially built his interception system around radar-guided ground control networks. Schräger Musik didn't replace that system. It made it lethal in a new way. The results, once multiple pilots began using the technique operationally, were devastating to an extent that took months to fully appear in Allied casualty statistics. RAF Bomber Command knew its losses were unsustainable, but attributed them largely to radar-guided conventional interceptions and improved flak. The possibility that a new attack method existed wasn't seriously entertained at first, for a simple and painful reason. Dead men don't file incident reports. When a Lancaster or Halifax was destroyed by Schräger Musik, there were typically no survivors. The attack came without warning. The aircraft detonated or went down in flames too rapidly for crews to bail out. Unlike a conventional fighter attack, where some percentage of surviving crewmen might parachute to safety and eventually provide intelligence about what had happened to them, the upward-firing cannon attack was nearly always total. There was no one left to describe what they had seen. The aircraft simply vanished from the formation, and the remaining crews assumed flak, assumed mechanical failure, assumed the fog of combat. The truth began to emerge piecemeal. A handful of tailgunners reported seeing a fighter below them before their aircraft was hit. A few pilots who managed to escape stricken aircraft described cannon fire from below. But these accounts were scattered, inconsistent, and easy to dismiss. The human mind, under the stress of combat, produces unreliable testimony. Allied intelligence analysts looked at the reports and weren't sure what to make of them. It was captured Luftwaffe pilots and captured aircraft, and crucially British code-breaking intelligence that eventually allowed RAF intelligence to piece together what was happening. By late 1943 and into 1944, the picture was becoming clearer and more horrifying. The upward-firing cannon wasn't a one-off experiment. It was standard equipment on a large percentage of Germany's night fighter fleet. It had been killing British and American crews for months, and the Allies had essentially no countermeasure. The numbers, when finally tallied, were almost incomprehensible. Some post-war analyses attributed 30 to 40% of all RAF heavy bomber losses over Germany in 1943 and 1944 to Schräger Musik attacks. Other estimates were higher. The specific accounting was difficult because so many of those aircraft simply disappeared, gone from the radar plot, gone from the formation, gone entirely. Some historians have argued that Schräger Musik was the single most lethal innovation in the night air war over Europe, more dangerous per aircraft than conventional fighter intercepts, more consistently lethal than even the heaviest flak concentrations. Among the pilots who mastered the technique, the kill rates were extraordinary. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring night fighter ace, used Schräger Musik to account for a significant portion of his 121 confirmed kills, a number so staggering it is difficult to fully comprehend. On a single night in February 1945, Schnaufer shot down 9 RAF aircraft in 14 minutes. 9 aircraft, 90 men, 14 minutes, using upward-firing cannons against opponents who never saw him coming. Martin Drews accounted for 52 kills, many of them using the same method. Georg Hermann Greiner, Paul Zorner, Helmut Lent, the names of Schräger Musik practitioners read like a catalogue of the most dangerous men in the night sky over Europe, each of them exploiting the same fundamental gap in the bomber's defenses that Schonert had identified in that briefing room that nobody took seriously. What makes this story particularly striking from the Allied perspective is the time it took to develop a response. The fundamental countermeasure, once understood, was technically straightforward. Add a rearward-facing downward gun position to the belly of heavy bombers, or install warning equipment that could detect a fighter approaching from below. These weren't impossible engineering problems, but implementing them required first believing the threat was real, then working through the bureaucratic and manufacturing challenges of modifying hundreds of aircraft already in production or operational service. By the time Musik was fully understood and documented by Allied intelligence, the strategic situation of the war was changing rapidly enough that some of the most obvious countermeasures were never fully implemented. The Allied long-range escort fighter, particularly the P-51 Mustang, which could now accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, was transforming the daylight bombing campaign. Nighttime bomber losses, while still significant, were no longer the existential crisis they had been in late 1943. The war's momentum was shifting in ways that made certain technical fixes less urgent than they had once seemed. Schonert himself survived the war. He ended the conflict with 64 confirmed aerial victories, the overwhelming majority of them achieved using the technique he had pioneered. He was never given the kind of public recognition that attached to some of his contemporaries. The Musik concept was, from the German perspective, a classified operational method, and operational secrecy suited everyone involved. After the war, Schonert emigrated to Argentina, as a significant number of Luftwaffe veterans did, and spent his later years in relative obscurity. He died in 1979, his name known primarily to dedicated students of aviation history rather than to the general public. The technique itself outlived the war in the engineering lessons it forced upon military aviation. Every bomber designed after 1945 incorporated lessons learned about defensive blind spots. The question of where a large aircraft was most vulnerable to attack became a foundational element of combat aircraft design, and the upward-firing cannon attack was a case study in nearly every serious curriculum on aerial combat theory in the post-war decades. The fundamental insight that the most effective attack is the one your enemy never anticipates because it violates their assumptions about how combat works became almost a cliché of military innovation. But Schonert arrived at it first, in a night fighter command office, looking at a geometry problem that everyone else had decided was simply the cost of doing business. The crews who flew those bombers through the night skies over Germany in 1943 and 1944 were among the bravest men of the Second World War. They climbed into unheated aircraft at 30 degrees below zero, flew for 8 hours through the most dangerous airspace on Earth, and did it night after night after night. The Musik attacks they died in without ever understanding what had hit them represents one of the war's more haunting ironies. That extraordinary courage, extraordinary sacrifice, and extraordinary determination could be negated by a relatively simple geometric insight and 2 cannons bolted into the ceiling of a cockpit. They deserved to know what was killing them. Most of them never did. What this story ultimately tells us about the Second World War, and about war in general, is that the decisive moments aren't always the grand ones. Not always the beach at Normandy, or the siege of Stalingrad, or the carrier battle in the Pacific. Sometimes the decisive moment is a frustrated pilot in a night fighter unit, staring at a diagram of a bomber's defensive arc, asking why everyone assumes those arcs are unchangeable. Sometimes the man who changes the war is the one who has the audacity to try something that everyone else has already decided is impossible, impractical, or beneath serious consideration. The night sky over Germany was full of silent disasters that history is still trying to account for. Musik was one of them, born from one man's refusal to accept that there was no better way, and devastating precisely because of how long it took anyone to believe such a thing could exist. If you found this story as extraordinary as we did, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history of the Second World War, the innovations, the individuals, and the decisions that shaped the most defining conflict of the modern era. The stories most people have never heard are often the ones that matter most. We'll see you in the next one.